Enquadrando o Tradutor é um programa de entrevistas da Pós-Graduação em Estudos da Tradução da Universidade Federal de Santa Catarina. Cada edição do programa vai contar com a presença de um tradutor ou tradutora, estudioso ou estudiosa da tradução, e o nosso convidado de hoje é o professor Alexis Levitin. Alexis, thank you for being here.
É um prazer.
Alexis Levitin translates works from Portugal, Brazil and Ecuador. His 48 books of translation include Clarice Lispector's Soul Storm and Eugênio de Andrade's Forbidden Words, both from New Directions. In 2010, he edited Brazil, A Traveler's Literary Companion. Recent books from Brazil include Astrid Cabral's Gazing Through Water and Salgado Maranhão's Palavra, mapping the tribe and consecration of the wolves. Forthcoming books from Brazil include Astrid Cabral's Spotlight on the Word and Leonor Cabral's Consecration of the Alphabet. Recent books from Portugal include The Art of Patience and Furrows of Thirst by Eugênio de Andrade, exemplary tales by Portugal's leading woman writer Sofia de Melo Breiner Andresen, and The Cattle of the Lord by Rosa Alice Branco. Recent books from Ecuador include Tobacco Dogs by Ana Minga, Destruction in the Afternoon by Santiago Vizcaíno, and Outrage by Carmen Bascones. He has been the recipient of 2 NEA Translation Awards and a participant in 2 NEA Summer Seminars. He was a senior Fulbright lecturer in Oporto and Coimbra, Portugal, in 1980. He was a Fulbright International Specialist teaching Shakespeare and the translation of American women poets into Spanish at the Catholic University of Santiago de Guayaquil, Ecuador, in 2015. In 2018, he served again as a Fulbright Specialist teaching Shakespeare, William Blake and Emily Dickinson, as well as the translation of contemporary American women poets into Portuguese, here at the Federal University of Santa Catarina. In addition, he has held translation residencies at Banff, Canada, Strelin, Germany twice, and the Rockefeller Foundation Study Center in Bellagio, Italy. In 1972, he came to Florianopolis to establish a new postgraduate program in English and American literature at the Federal University of Santa Catarina, PPGI. That program has grown into a major doctoral program today. Obrigado, Professor Alexis. Thank you so much for being here with us. It is a pleasure to have you here.
Obrigado para a convite.
So, my first question to you is, how was it that you began your work as a translator? When and how did you start translating?
I spent 2.5 years here at UFSC in Florianopolis, and when my best student finished her master's defense, I knew that the program would survive. And so I went back to the United States. And I went back with a box of books from Brazil, including Clarice Lispector, Luis Vilela, and muitos outros livros, and not finding a job my first year back in America, I had plenty of free time, and so I started to translate. And it was great fun. It helped me retain my connection to the Portuguese language. And in fact, everything I translated got published. For half a year, everything I sent out to magazines was accepted, because at the time, the United States was enthralled by what is called the boom, which was interest in Latin American writers, and especially in magic realism. That was probably provoked by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, but there were plenty of other Latin American writers from Peru, Chile, Argentina, and of course Jorge Amado was very well known in the United States already. So a real interest in South America was blossoming just at the time when I returned from Brazil. And so I was very lucky. Everything I did got published. And as time passed, I became more and more interested in what I really love, which is translating poetry. And so, for the most part, I gave up on fiction. And that's how it began.
Okay, that's Sounds like great timing, really. Could you comment on literary translation in general and what would be its major challenges?
Well, I can tell you what its major reward is, which is that a literary translator is the best reader, because the literary translator has to read seeking not only the overt meaning or denotative meaning of words, but the overall effect, especially in poetry, of what the words and the ordering of the words sounds like. To me, the most challenging and interesting and rewarding aspect of translation, for me personally, is the pursuit of the music of language. First, you listen to the music of the original instrument, which is Portuguese. If it is Brazilian, it's even more musical, in a sense, than, or at least it sounds more musical than the poetry of Portugal, though in fact the great Portuguese poets like Eugenio de Andrade and Sofia de Mello-Brenda Anderson are extremely musical. And Eugenio thinks of himself as a musical poet. In any case, for me, the most exciting reward and the most exciting challenge is indeed what to do with the music of the original. How to resonate, how to echo, how to reverberate with something in English that carries the spirit, the sentiment, the soul, so to speak, of the original. So I would like to give a little background. Before I even came to Brazil, when I was already 29 years old, not knowing a word of Portuguese, I had already been exposed throughout my life to a number of other European languages. My mother and my stepfather spoke Russian at home. My mother spoke German with her father and with her sister. And their closest friends when I was a little child were the de Rougemonts, with whom they spoke French. So even as an infant, I grew up surrounded by at least Russian, German, and French, as well as, of course, English, since I was growing up in New York. So languages were part of the ocean in which I swam as a child. And whether I understood them or not didn't make a difference to me. I was completely happy, immersed in these foreign languages, and sometimes oblivious to the content. As far as the transition to becoming a real translator, that happened after I left Brazil, where I had learned your beautiful language, and returned to America, and I didn't want to lose my Portuguese, and so I began to translate. And I was very lucky in the beginning, since America was swept away by what was called the boom of South American literature. And so I was very lucky, and I received the reward of being published in many magazines. And that, of course, encouraged me, and so I kept going. But of course I drifted towards poetry because that's what I care about most.
Alexis, could you tell us the books or authors that you enjoyed translating the most?
Well, it's not an easy question to answer. I translated Clarice Lispector in the very beginning, and I got great joy from that. But all that was more than 40 years ago. In fact, I started translating Clarice Lispector 50 years ago. So it's a memory of a joy. And then, for over 20 years, I worked every summer with Eugenio de Andrade in Portugal. And until I came to understand how important the music of language was to him, until I understood that, I was not enthralled translating him. When I came to understand that what we were really talking about was the music of words, the music of syllables, in fact, When I realized that, my whole attitude changed, and I got great joy from translating Eugenio for the next 20 years. I can still remember how I would sit in his apartment and he would recite his poems to me, accompanying himself like a conductor. And that accompaniment showed me how important the movement of the language, the combinations of the sounds of the language were to him. And so that guided me in my practice as a translator.
Excellent. That leads us to the next question, which would be, do you find more excitement or enjoyment translating prose or poetry?
No, for me the excitement is translating poetry because it's a greater challenge and also it's a greater reward. This is a bit perhaps of an overstatement, but if we could argue that in the case of poetry every word counts, then obviously the rewards are greater. The challenges are greater and the rewards are greater. If you make one mistake in a poem, it throws the whole rhythm off. It throws the song off. And in fiction, words of course are important, and even the sound of words are important, but not as nakedly exposed as they are in poetry. So I much prefer translating poetry.
And I know that recently you've published a book of short stories, a collection of short stories. Would you say that your working as a translator for so many years has helped you become a writer somehow?
That's a really good question and I don't know the answer. I would say what helped me become a writer when I was already over the hill, already retired, already somebody who can hardly walk, though I can still think. I would say that what really inspired me was the pandemic, COVID. Because when I returned from Brazil to America in the end of March, was it 2019 or 2020?
2020.
I returned around March 20th, 2020, locked myself up in my house, and basically didn't leave for 2 years. So, what really pushed me into a new life as a writer of my own stories was, frankly, the fear of death. If you're going to die, what can you do about it? You can't prevent it, but maybe you can fill what time you have left with something of value. So that's what I was trying to do. And a suppressed inner creative life that I had never expressed before came out so fluidly and so rapidly that I wrote 103 stories in just 2 years, and half of them have already been published in magazines. And a third of them have resulted in a book of short stories that came out half a year ago. So all of that was totally unexpected, and it was like a gift. Like a gift. You felt that that's why, for thousands of years, people have spoken about the muse. The muse represents this force that we don't understand. All we know is it isn't just us. I didn't feel that I wrote those stories. I felt that they came from somewhere else. But I realize that's a little bit mystical sounding, and I don't really know what to say. Obviously what they came out of was a suppressed inner life that never bothered to express itself in words for 75 years. And when they came out, I think, with a voice. And I never even thought that I had a voice. I had to develop a voice to be Clarice Lispector. I had to develop a voice to be Eugenio d'Andrade. I had to develop a voice to be Sofia de Mello-Brenna Anderson or Alberto Helder. Or Alexandre O'Neill, or all the different people, Viamahasa Pais Brandão, Astrid Cabral, Salgado Marañón. These are the writers whom I translated a great deal, and I had to develop a voice for each of them. But it wasn't exactly my voice. It was a combination of their voice and my response to their voice.
would you consider self-translating your own short stories?
No.
Or could I translate them?
Sure.
Okay, good. Okay, so my next question is, could you tell us a bit about how Brazilian or Lusophone literature has been received in the US?
Okay, well, in truth, there's a real problem for Lusophone literature in the US, and the problem is simple. You can even guess what it is. Mexico is our next door neighbor, and America is full of Mexicans and other Central Americans, and there are places in America where you don't even hear English. For instance, the Miami airport. Everybody at the Miami airport speaks Spanish. So Spanish is actually the second language in the United States. In French we would say pour force majeure. There simply are more of them. And so America is learning to accept Spanish as a second language. This is most unfortunate for Brazilian and Portuguese literature, because even in academia, the Portuguese segment of Latin American studies or of Romance languages always is much smaller than the Spanish section. And so, with certain exceptions, I have to say that there isn't a broad acceptance or knowledge of Brazilian or Portuguese literature. Now, the exception, am I allowed to say negative things in this interview?
I don't mind at all.
Well, the exception is, of course, something like Paulo Coelho. So that the ordinary American, the ordinary semi-literate American who has never thought much about anything, and that is the bulk of my fellow Americans are like that, are pretty comfortable reading The Alchemist by your famous Paulo Coelho. I don't know if that counts as Brazilian literature, but that is what the average American knows. Okay. Now, the average educated American probably knows Jorge Amado as well. But when you get to great people like Manuel Bandeira, Carlos Drummond de Andrade, and even João Cabral de Melo Neto, I would say that out of the 300 million people in America, there are probably 10,000 who have ever heard of them. In other words, it's a small population that is familiar with the best of... And Guimarães Rosa, who is the greatest writer of Brazil and maybe of South America, almost no one in America has heard of Guimarães Rosa. So that's the truth of the situation.
So your translations of Clarice Lispector were probably the earliest ones published with new directions. Could you tell us a bit about the Clarice Lispector case in the United States? Sure.
First of all, something extraordinary has happened to Clarice Lispector in the United States in the last 10-15 years, and that is that New Directions has undertaken a series of retranslations of almost all her books, and they've done great publicity for it, great distribution, and from becoming a rather cult figure, somebody admired by a few people scattered around the country, scattered around the universities, the world of academia, and perhaps scattered in the world of feminist studies. From that position, she has become now almost a mainstream writer in America. And at this moment, she is one of the 10 most best-selling books on the New Direction list. So that's extraordinary, that's very good. And since we all love Lispector, we're glad to see it happen. As far as the history goes, there were many books by Lispector that were translated long before the new project at New Directions. My book, Soulstorm, which actually comprised two collections of her last writings, Onde Estivestes de Noite e Havia Crosses de Corpo. Those two books, consisting of a total of 29 stories, I translated because they were given to me as a goodbye present when I left Brazil. And Clarice Lispector gave me permission to publish those stories in magazines. She was still alive at the time, though she was already ill. And we exchanged letters, but I never met her. In any case, I translated her for many years and published her in magazines. And when an editor at New Directions heard about my project, he approached the owner and founder, James Laughlin, and said, I have a guy who's translating Clarice Lispector. What do you think? Laughlin said, take it immediately. Sign a contract immediately. Because I think Laughlin had heard about Lispector through Hélène Cixous, the French feminist critic, who really was quite famous, even in those days. I'm talking about 35 years ago. So they took my manuscript and they published it, and that was their first publication of Lispector. More recently, they have undertaken to redo everything, and I have nothing against that project or the results. The results are good. They've made Lispector more famous. She has more readers. She deserves more readers. All of that is good. My only quibble with what has happened is that the organizer of the new output of Lispector in English claims regularly in interviews and in articles that Lispector had no voice in English until he came along. Well, I would suggest you look at my book, which was published in 1989, and I think you will see a voice. I think I found a voice for her. But I would never say that the new voices are worse or are wrong. I would say that different translators can find different ways of creating the voice of this otherworldly, incredibly individualistic, superhuman woman that Clarice Lispector was. So I think if you look at Gregory Rabassa, Elizabeth Lowe, Ronaldo Souza, Giovanni Ponteiro, or my translation of Lispector, these are all translations from the 70s and the 80s. I think you'll find a voice representing Lispector quite well. And if you look at the new wave of translations, you will also find voices that represent her very well. When a writer is great, this is my opinion and not everyone would agree. When a writer is great, like Lispector or Chekhov, the translator, in my opinion, becomes a little less important, because somehow the greatness of a Chekhov and of a Lispector comes through almost no matter who the translator is. Now, not all translators would agree with me, but that's what I feel about the greatest. I feel that way about Tolstoy, about Chekhov, about Lispector.
Alexis, thank you so much. That was very elegant, I must say. Thank you so much for being here and for the opportunity to interview you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.